Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. Recently on Blessed Man Meditations, we've been going through the book by Eric Metaxas entitled Is Atheism Dead? Eric Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. He's a host of a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series by the name of Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal some time ago. And in fact, I believe it's in one of the appendices of Is Atheism Dead? This book here. There's an article that he put in the Wall Street Journal about the scientific evidence for God. So we continue part 3, What is Truth, with chapter 27. This time it is entitled Further Problems with Atheism. So we've covered the Copernican principle and how devout atheists have expressed elation at the idea that we on Earth were no longer at the physical center of the universe, as though this somehow demoted human beings and erased the idea of God who put them at the center, because the atheists will try as hard as they can to try to remove influence of reference to God, because they think that we moved on from such elementary principles. But they miss the point entirely, because with God at the center and everything flowing from him and owed to him, life is much more abundant, full, and while not free of troubles and problems, it is definitely a life worth living for the Lord. So we've also discussed the idea of the fine-tuned universe and the anthropic principle, which catapults human beings to a level of specialness exponentially beyond merely being at the physical center of the solar system. But before we move on, we might ask why atheists would so revel in dancing on what they obviously believe is the grave of God, and the grave of human beings is somehow extraordinary. Why? Why would they be so excited to get rid of God? My own personal theory is that they don't want moral accountability. So if they can remove the idea of a moral lawgiver and remove the idea of accountability to that lawgiver, then they can live under the illusion that they can live as they want. That is, of course, fraught with problems. So the atheists should they should seem to leap and twinkle at, or should they leap and twinkle at the idea that we're essentially the equals of eels and cockroaches and bacteria? Because really, if we all are just from one common ancestor, that is what it equates to, that we're essentially the equals of eels, cockroaches, and bacteria. One may disagree with their logic, but must still wonder, why do they take such inverse pride in denigrating their own species? Yes, why should, in effect, it's almost an insult to humanity to equate them with eels, cockroaches, and bacteria. Why is that such a big deal that they do that for them? It's insulting. It seems unavoidably perverse and can seem so dark that it comes across as diabolical, as though in rejecting God they've unwittingly taken on the opinions of God's eternal foe, who himself is not at all confused with whether God exists, but sure knows that he does exist, and despises and wishes to murder him, even at times having essayed to do so, and uniquely despises those whom God uniquely cherishes. That must be a reference to the devil, because the devil would be God's eternal foe. The devil's not confused about whether or not God exists. The devil knows God exists. The devil despises God and wishes that he could murder God, even though he can't, and even though it's God who granted him life in the beginning before he willingly chose to rebel and fall and sin against God. And it is the devil who despises those whom God uniquely cherishes. He wishes that he could separate Christians from God's love, but he knows that he can't, so he will try to make their life as troublesome as possible. And probably one of the tools that he does accomplish that with, under God's sovereignty, one of the tools that the devil uses to accomplish making Christians as miserable as he can is which of course takes place under the umbrella of the sovereignty of God, is he uses the devil will use the atheist to try to discourage the atheists and other non-Christian groups too, but to try to discourage Christians, to try to distract Christians, to try to make existence for Christians more difficult on this side of eternity. So the oft expressed joy at believing we aren't special, even if it isn't true that we aren't special, because God says we are special, curious, nor can it be really called joy. Perhaps the cognate among such persons would be schadenfreude. But again, why? You'll have to look that word up. I'm not sure what that word means. Certainly, it cannot be thought normal, natural, or healthy to denigrate oneself or to hate one's tribe or species. Pride in one's country or hometown is the most normal and natural thing there is, and one of the simplest pleasures of life. It's to rejoice in the particulars of our particularity, to say that my school or my team is the best, to say that I love my country and its food and its traditions. We all know how that can go wrong, but have we forgotten how its opposite can go wrong? We speak too rarely of how it can be healthy and beautiful and a way of appreciating something near us that will enable us to appreciate all that's good and true and beautiful and beyond it. We can either get too prideful about our existence or we can get too pessimistic about our existence. We must also ask to what these ideas lead, or to what these ideas have led. It is one thing to respect and care for the other species in God's creation, but if we do not ourselves believe we are made in God's image and are not sacred or special in any way, we certainly cannot say that each human life has dignity and inherent value. Right, on theism, because man is created in God's image, the theist can say that each human life has dignity and inherent value. But the atheist cannot say that. They're just a little higher than the animal. When it's the book of Hebrews that says that God made man a little lower than the angels. We were made in God's image, but the atheist says that we're not sacred, that we're not special, that each human life has dignity. And then what? Then what can they say? If one believes that we're the products of random evolution, like the atheist does, that blindly selected upward, us, then we know, then by dint of its having happened accidentally, it is quite meaningless. We really have no particular value, even if we're smarter than other creatures. Right. I mean, we're just instead of being just a little lower than the angels, we're just barely above the caterpillars. So then how can we get away from the logical conclusion that murdering a human being or several human beings is any different than swatting horseflies? Right. And that's the rationale behind things like the Holocaust, which was, as we looked at earlier in this book, that was spearheaded by underlying atheistic values. Stalin and Hitler didn't see murdering human beings or several human beings to be any different than swatting horseflies. Some atheists, such as Peter Singer, have openly averred such unpleasant things, which we must applaud for its intellectual honesty. Yes, Singer's is pointing out the absurdity that humans are just barely better than horseflies. That's not reasonable or rational to come to the conclusion that humans are just barely better than horseflies, and Peter Singer apparently recognizes that. Nonetheless, his idea that a newborn baby is no different than a pig or a snake and may be killed if we choose doesn't sit well with most people. So, if it's true that Peter Singer has averred that is averse to the fact that human beings are much better than horseflies, he doesn't really seem to think so, because maybe Peter Singer says that a newborn baby is no different than a pig or a snake. And if that's so, then Peter Singer's pretty much just as bad as Hitler or Stalin, if that's true about Peter Singer. Is that simply because we're not as enlightened as Mr. Singer? Do we not think that a newborn baby is no different than a pig or a snake? Do we think that a newborn baby is different than a pig or a snake because we're not as enlightened as Mr. Singer? Would it be braver and more honest of us to admit that evolution makes us all equal, and that the repulsion at murdering or devouring a child or a neighbor or a parent is only a social construct, one that we were brave and truly rational we would kick away with no more difficulty than a child must kick away his aversion to eating vegetables as the vegetables he dislikes? Why should we value human life on atheism? What's the difference? If a bacterium has no real value and human beings also have no real value, who can stop us from declaring that the laws prohibiting murder should be struck down as vestiges of some ancient irrational order? Right. Let's just survival of the fittest, man. I mean, let's just kill who's not most fit. And that's what Hitler and Stalin did, and let's just fill the earth with nothing but what we think is most fit. Who cares if other people don't agree with us? I mean, that's essentially what the people like Hitler would have you to think. Or if we were to assign relative values to all animals, and we could hope to say that we really do have more value and more rights than a beetle or a tadpole, on what basis would we assign values to animals? Many, like Singer, have already done the homework on this for us and have said that our value comes from things other than our common humanity. If we have intelligence and usefulness, and who determines whether we have intelligence or usefulness, then we have more value than someone with less intelligence and usefulness. Yeah, who determines what's intelligent? Who determines what's useful? What's the criteria? And the people who don't have the requisite level of intelligence and requisite level of usefulness, what happens to them? And who gets to decide what happens to them, and why? Why do they get to decide what happens to them? This is when morality becomes arbitrary, and anything goes, and people begin doing what's right in their own eyes. And then you have things like abortion, as horrific as that is, taking place because a baby is not deemed as intelligent or useful as a fully grown adult who made the decision to engage in fornication, adultery, and then tried to cover it up by having the abortion, trying to ignore the fact that their conscience has God's word written on it, God's law written on it, and they might not be able to quote the verse, but they will know that the God that they willfully suppress the truth of hates adultery and fornication and will judge it. So bright adults may avoid trouble, but young children may be murdered with no more concern than we would gut or a perch or butcher a hog. So without the absolute morality of the theistic worldview, the murder of children can be carried out without much further consideration. In fact, the fish and hog have value dead. You can eat them, but the child would not have value dead, since we still subscribe to the ancient taboos against cannibalism. So we even might wish to argue that killing a child and simply disposing of it would be wasteful. Surely we could at least make some money from selling the child's parts and do some good with the money from the parts that we get from selling the child's parts. One problem with this line of thinking is that it's precisely the same line of thinking that was embraced by the Nazis. There's no way around the realization that this line of thinking is precisely the same line of thinking that was embraced by the Nazis. The Nazis cynically gave public lip service to God, but were grimly... Yeah, I've heard people erroneously say, well, Hitler claimed to be a Christian. Well, no. The Nazis cynically gave public lip service to God, but were grimly calculating atheists in practice. And the moment they had power to put all the serious Christians in concentration camps or on the front lines of war, the sooner to die. And they did precisely as they always wanted to do, without any backward religious people to carpet them. Yes, they wanted to exterminate that religious group. The ones who knew and would confront them on the moral outrage of their actions. They wanted to get rid of them, so the backward religious people could no longer carpet them. For example, everyone considered mentally ill was thought to be a drain on the National Social State and logically ought not to be fed and cared for with valuable resources that could otherwise be employed in winning the war. That surely sounds like survival of the fittest to me. Because they're identifying the mentally ill as not fit, so they don't want them to survive, because they can't. The mentally ill cannot contribute to the National Socialist state and the war effort, so they want them gone, so they don't have to consume resources on the mentally ill, but rather have those resources consumed on those that are fit to fight for the atheistic Nazi cause. Under the gruesome T4 program, innumerable hospitalized, handicapped people were murdered, or rather euthanized via injection. Yeah, they would use the term euthanized to soften the moral stigma of the term murdered. The corpses of the euthanized were delivered to crematoria, and their parents received a package containing their ashes and a letter claiming they died of natural causes, so they were lied to. They were declared to be life unworthy of life. The Nazis had the power to say as much and act on it, and they did. It will doubtless upset strict materialists and atheists to be lumped in with the Nazis. But taking offense is no argument against the facts that I've just described, that Metaxas has just described. And since atheists loudly ally themselves with reason and rationality, how shall we shrink from asking them to defend their positions reasonably and rationally? Yes, if the atheistic worldview undergirded Nazi Germany and the philosophies and practices of all the extermination that went on in Nazi Germany, how can an atheist defend the morality in that? I would shudder to even hear them try. We must hear how it can be that atheists maintain we're merely material beings with no transcendent value, but blanch and sputter when it's pointed out that this is what Hitler and the Soviet National Socialists believed and carried out with typically and tragically German efficiency. It is what today's Chinese Communist Party leaders believe too, who profit from their conviction by murdering healthy Uyghur Muslims to sell their organs, because wealthy and ailing Saudis fussily reject the organs of non-Muslims and will pay a premium for those of their murdered co-religionists. The Chinese government's now able to fetch $500,000 for murder. Money is, the scriptures say that the love of money is the root of all evil. And I can definitely understand how $500,000 would be a motivating factor to carry out atrocious acts if you're so blinded by materialism and wealth, materialism in the sense of material wealth, that you take no thought for the value of human life, because you're only concerned about your primary concern in that case is to make your life as opulent and pleasant as possible. But you don't care who you have to hurt, or in this case murder, in order to get pleasure for yourself. The Nazis were similarly logical and rational. And when it came to deliberately murdering millions of men, women, and children, they did not do so with the bodies. They did not do with the bodies what less calculating murderers would, but saw through to the bottom of their philosophy, which declared that not only were these lives not worth keeping alive, but they were valuable for their raw materials when dead, just like an animal's body. I guess they're harvesting organs, or yeah, I think they described some really atrocious things in this chapter. The Nazis did not have the technology of today's Chinese communists, but they did the best they could under the circumstances. Not only were gold teeth removed from the corpses. This is the Nazis again. Not only were gold teeth removed from the corpses, which any desperate or ordinary grave robber might do, but the Nazis used the hair of their victims and even rendered the fat of their flesh to make soap. I've heard of using lard to make, possibly even tallow to make soap. When I read this, I was just shocked that they would use human fat to make soap. Why not? Why is that objectionable, to use hair and to use human hair and to use human flesh for other purposes? Why is that objectionable? Why is that? Why not? Why not have a problem with that? On what grounds would this be in any way objectionable to people who believe we're neither transcendent nor sacred? Right. Apart from a theistic worldview, one in which the existence of God is realized and lived out, if you don't have that foundation, then you can justify almost anything. Or even if you say that you don't agree with practices like this, you can't justify it with any kind of absolute truth. You can justify it with your own subjective standard. But there's not a universally agreed upon atheistic standard of objective truth. They'll talk about objective truth until they're blue in the face, but they can't justify it absolutely. They just can't, because it's an ever-changing standard. Aren't our objections just ancient and irrational taboos that we should see through and dispense with? The Nazis even used the skin of their victims to make lampshades and other decorative objects, just as we do with the skin of cows or alligators, so that skin with tattoos was especially prized. Can you imagine having a lamp in your home during the time of World War II where the lampshade was made of human skin? That's vile. It follows from an atheist worldview that if these human beings have no inherent value, we may treat them as we would other animals, and that is apparently what the Nazis did. If we regard them merely as material objects, why shouldn't we, who are above them on the evolutionary scale, since having survived them, we are by definition fitter? Yes, we are more fit because we've survived. Why shouldn't we use the less fit for our profit? If other humans are not created in God's image, if they're just lower on the evolutionary totem pole, if they're just material objects, if we are more evolved than they are somehow, why don't we just use them for our profit? That's the rhetorical question, which is absurd. Of course, we shouldn't, because every human's created in God's image, flaws and all, imperfections and all, handicaps and all. Everyone's created in God's image, and it's objectively, abhorrently, morally wrong to do these things that the Nazis did in any era. The Nazis not only accepted Darwin's theory, but were willing to follow Darwin's theory to its logical end, or follow Darwin's logic to the end. So on what basis do atheists today take issue with these things that the atheist Nazis did not take issue with during World War II? And on what basis would the atheists tell the Chinese communists who are doing similar things today that they should stop? Why should the atheists today tell the Chinese communists to stop committing their atrocities? We talked about some of the Chinese atrocities on our previous video for this book earlier in this series. How can we talk about human rights when human beings are randomly selected creatures no different than any others? Why should humans have any rights at all? Unless you are operating from a theistic worldview, which says that God made humans a little lower than the angels, that he endowed him with rationality and a conscience and things that do not exist in the animal kingdom. On what basis could we talk about humans having rights? So why do the atheists rage? So it is interesting to ask what animates atheists, and especially these new atheists, in their scorched earth campaigns against religion. Why do they rage so harshly against people of religion? Do they themselves know why they rage such? Why do they exult in the denigration of their own species, and why do they boil with fury at those who disagree with them? Why do some of them talk about having respect for everyone and yet disrespect the theists so much? Their graceless rage at whoever deviates from their subjective orthodoxy has no discernible logic and reminds many of the worst of what one observes in religious zealots. You can see plenty of people in the name of religion being out of control and obnoxious. And then they will use that as fuel to speak against religion, but then some from the atheist camp will be just as obnoxious in espousing their views as well. In John Lennox's book, Gunning for God, Why the New Atheists Are Missing the Target, the Oxford mathematician John Lennox writes, quote, "Like me, there are many scientists and others who think that the new atheism is a belief system which ironically provides a classic example of the blind faith it so vocally despises in others. Atheism, ironically, is a blind faith. The atheist will accuse the theist of believing in God with lack of evidence, which is a false conclusion anyway. They will say that the theist believes in God based on no evidence or bad evidence, and that's just not true. Why can they call it bad evidence? Who defines what evidence is good and what evidence is bad, and why? The standard that they are setting for whether evidence is good or bad is a subjective standard that changes with the seasons. It's not a standard that remains unchanging throughout the eons. Whatever it is that motivates Dawkins and motivated Hitchens to the heights of scorn and invective cannot be rational, despite their irrational claims to rationality. Yes, they are not being rational in their invective against religion. Anyone with the least amount of common sense knows that seeing faults in an idea or philosophy does not necessarily preclude seeing some good things too. So why can these new atheists not admit, for example, that not all faiths are equal, or that not all faiths are bad? There are some definitely good things about faiths, but why can't they admit any of the positive? Why can they not admit anything good about any faith? Why can they not see that many people of faith have even sometimes demonstrated love to their enemies, or have made self-sacrificial efforts to help strangers? But for no reasons that seem clear, the new atheists perversely refuse to concede even these well-documented facts that people have performed many good acts based on their religious faith. And the atheist might respond and say, well, yeah, well, I don't have faith and I can still do good even without having faith. And that's true. That's fine. But you can't just criticize all people of faith just because they are people of faith. Nor would a strictly rational person rage against the idea of faith simply because some people of faith have behaved poorly, any more than a rational person would denounce motherhood as a vile lie because there exist some mothers who've not been loving to their children. So just because there are some people who have represented their faith poorly, that does not mean that all faith is bad. No one has yet appeared on the lecture circuit to denounce motherhood precisely because we see exceptions for what they are. They are exceptions, not the rule. But the new atheists seem to revel in tossing caution and nuance to the wind. They focus on the exceptions and say that the exceptions are representative of everyone, as if they're not an exception. Everyone's just like the exception. And that's ridiculous. So to search for rhyme or reason in what they say can sometimes be like trying to parse the ravings of a madman. In particularly purple whites, they contradict themselves at nearly every turn of phrase, boustrophodonically doubling back on themselves again and again in ways that seem tangential and tangled, yet the proudly indignant determination with which they speak captivates and carries us forward until it seems to have entirely forgotten the objection that a moment ago bothered us, for they have moved on and are still moving on and on and on. Part of this may be intentional strategy on their parts, but whether conscious or unconscious, or what part of each, is impossible to say. Hitchens, in particular, hardly seemed to care a jot for consistency or truth, but given his anti-creedal creed, why should he have cared? How could he or his compatriots be expected to? For that would require a universal standard, and where could that come from if we and our ideas about such things arose randomly over the eons, like the miasma of a morning fog from the riverbed of our planet's youth? But Hitchens was good at histrionics, carefully managing his image as the perpetually indignant enfant terrible, with his carefully disheveled hair and faux meaningful gaze of outrage at the stupidities he and his fellow noble atheists had to endure at the heights of unenlightened saps, the religious folk, that he knew, like some mountebank or confidence man, that by the time you wondered if he had just said something slightly wrong-footed, he would charge ahead with another brace or three of witticisms or harms such that you instantly forgot about it. He wanted to dominate the discourse with theists. Hitchens wanted to dominate the discourse with theists and so impress you with his diction that you would be so taken back by his way, the way he was, his presentation, mannerisms, his expressions, his choice of words, his accent even. He just must be superior or right, and that poor sap that he was discoursing with must be wrong. And thus he proceeded through the years into the perfect silence of the grave that he pretended held no meaning or serious questions or fear for him, for it would only hold the quieted and colder form of what he had been all along, an animated and now inanimate animal with no soul or intrinsic value or future or any kind, a pile of nothing much, for we are only matter and more matter, none of which ever matter one whit, if only we had the honesty and courage to see it. What a bleak and hopeless outlook, that we are a pile of nothing much, that we have no intrinsic value, that we are just an animal, that we don't matter. What a hopeless, pointless existence on that worldview. But not every but not every atheist looks at their own existence in such a negative way, but I wouldn't blame them if they did, based on those thoughts. But again, we ask, if this is true, why thunder as Hitchens thundered? What was the point of thundering like he thundered? The question he could never answer seriously or straightforwardly, and he was smart enough to know it, but seems to have keep these questions at bay, even from himself, be what looked like perpetual forward movement in essays, speeches, books, and debates at the point of haggardness, or to let these important questions linger too long might be the beginning of his undoing, and that would never do. But the larger point is that by insisting on many things that were not true, or at least not entirely true, the new atheists eventually twisted themselves into pretzels of illogic, just as a liar must lie more and more boldly to support the first lie, and wittingly or unwittingly use their emotions, usually passionate anger, as a cover for the logical gaps. So now we're going to look at the brain is not a mind, and the mind is not a brain. Stephen Meyer. You listen to him talk. He is a scientist. I believe went to college, got a PhD at Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. Very knowledgeable Christian science, believes in intelligent design, happens to be a Christian. You will hear him talking a lot about the mind behind the universe, the mind behind design, and how that mind points to a designer. He's written some books. Maybe one day I'll go through one or more of those on this channel, perhaps. The brain is not a mind, the mind is not a brain. We said earlier that atheist materialists assert, with no evidence, that matter is all there is. Since this is not true, since it is not true that matter is all there is, since it can't be proven to be true that matter is all there is, it would lead, like all other semi, demi, hemi truths, to cul-de-sacs and trouble. For example, if matter is all that exists everywhere, then although human beings have brains, they do not have minds. This is a crucial distinction. Materialists say there's a squishy, wet piece of pink-gray matter inside our skulls, and that is who we are. So when you die and it rots, there is no you left. There's no mind or soul apart from that mushy computer in your skull. This is conceivably true, but there's much evidence to the contrary, and it's certain that no one can prove it is true. Materialists, and of course atheists who are materialists, know that the concept of mind contradicts their belief that there is nothing transcendent, nothing beyond the material. So any hint that there's anything beyond our mere organic brains is out of bounds and too hysterical to be countenanced even as conceivably possible. So the materialist atheist is not going to want to acknowledge that there is a mind. Stories of people leaving their bodies during operations, watching themselves being operated on, which exist in the multiplied thousands, must all be hallucinations. Even though these stories often involve the unconscious and anesthetized patient seeing things and knowing things going on during the operation that an unconscious anesthetized patient could not possibly see or could not possibly know. I've heard stories, interviews from people who have said that they've been on an operating table and they've left their body and they've traveled outside the hospital, if you will, and seen things going on outside the hospital, and then come back and they've said what went on outside the hospital, and sure enough, those facts were corroborated while the person was on the operating table. So that's those types of stories, and there, like Metaxas says, there are multiplied thousands. Metaxas said stories like that demonstrate that there is a consciousness that exists apart from physical body. That would be the spirit, which of course the theist believes in, and the atheist doesn't. But these stories must all be rejected on atheism, even if they're even if they are the stories of brilliant and sober-minded persons, and even if the details of those stories are corroborated by doctors. For the atheist materialist, even to be open to the idea that it is possible some of these stories could be true is asking too much. They must be ruled out by definition. The idea of consciousness must be waved away too. Somehow, though no one can begin to point to how, our mushy, squishy brains yield something we call consciousness, where we are aware of ourselves and our surroundings in a way that a robot can never be aware, despite the fact that he might himself have a complex computer brain of circuits which materialists say is in no way any different from our brains, except less spongy and moist. But what is consciousness, and how does a mere brain make that leap to consciousness apart from what we call a mind? No one has any idea, but materialists and atheists assure us that it doesn't matter. As with other impossibly tangled conundrums along such lines, they either say, we don't know yet, but for sure we will find out, we just know we will, and any evidence against our baseless but hopeful attitude is inherently wrong and must be dismissed, and harshly too, for the sake of humanity. Right, they will just yell and flail and scream, and as a friend of mine would say, stick forks in their eyes. Obviously joking, figuratively speaking with that one. But they'll do that, and people will see their histrionics, and many of them will submit to those histrionics. So they'll either say we don't know yet, or that consciousness is an illusion. So let's just forget about it there. We're done with the subject. What would you like for lunch? Not that you really have a choice, since free will and consciousness are an illusion, and you're pre-programmed by your genes to choose some particular thing given the particular circumstances in which you now find yourself. You're what some have called a meat robot. Frank Turek uses the term moist robots. But don't be depressed about that. It's only depressing if you think about it. Although if your genes have programmed you to think about it, you don't really have a choice whether to think about it, do you? Perhaps you're one of those less fit creatures whose survival ought to have been curtailed. Perhaps it's just we who have evolved in the direction of not thinking about the bleak meaningless of life who should survive and perpetuate the species. But why should evolution care about the perpetuation of a species that has no purpose and that cannot face the fact that it has no purpose? Again, we don't know, and if we want to know, it only makes the case that we aren't as fit as those who don't want to know. Get it? Good. Not really. Or not necessarily good, since good and evil are immaterial. Yeah, he's trying to sound confusing, I think, but something like good, or perhaps not. Perhaps even trying to make any sense of this goes against what we are, if we really are only matter that has mindlessly come to produce whatever it is that we are. And if that's true, what is there to say, really? If we're only matter, then nothing matters. Isn't that about the gist of it? That is the end of chapter 27 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. He is a rather brilliant orator. He's pretty funny too. And he really has an intelligent way of putting his case together, in my opinion. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I think we've got 3 more chapters, 28, 29, and 30, plus possibly an appendix or more. So we're getting closer to the end of this book. So again, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.